Hi, you've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. And today I'm really excited to say that I'm here with Dean Meadows, who's the Daily Apologist. And Dean's been an apologist for a while. He's been active in the apologetics community. And so I have him on my channel. We're going to talk about reasons to believe. We're also going to talk about some of the strongest reasons we found to believe in Christianity and theism. And we're also going to go into some of the arguments against our reasons, just to make it more fun and to spice it up a little bit. So we're going to do that. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dean. And Dean, would you like to share a little bit about your background, how you came to Christianity, and then we'll get into our questions.
Sure, would love to. I grew up in a small town called Farmville, Virginia, and I know most people out there are probably like, "Oh, that's like the Facebook game," and you'd be correct. Rural town, small town, right in the middle of Virginia. Went to Prince Edward County High School. Grew up in a setting where we went to church fairly consistently. Growing up, then about 14, 15, 16, somewhere in that time frame, I started to really ask some questions about is this stuff true? And like most people, I freely will admit that I had a emotional experience that led me to believe that it was true. And then I enlisted into the Marine Corps at 18. Went and did a deployment in Iraq at 19 back in 2006. And then during that time frame, from about 2006 to 2007, really started to question the truthfulness of the Christian worldview, and really said, I need to be independent and try and look at this from an objective standpoint to see if it's true. And that's when I started really digging into some of the other literature that was out there that was not Christian literature, and kind of compared that with some of the Christian literature as well, and ended up coming to the belief that the Christian worldview is the correct Christian worldview. It is not the correct Christian worldview, but is the correct worldview, that it's true. And from that point forward, I got into ministry, went to Bible school for 2 years. I'm a minister in Gastonia right now. And then, I do apologetics as much as possible. I've got my wife, who is super supportive with 2 kids, Nora Grace, who is 2, and Ren Mercy, who is 1, and they keep me on my toes day in and day out. So that's just a little bit about my background. The other thing is I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit called the Daily Apologist. We've got a Twitter handle, obviously, YouTube channel, The Daily Apologist. We've got a website, www.thedailyapologist.com, where we do blogs and videos and all that good stuff. So there's the shameless plug portion of the introduction.
Oh, that's wonderful. And actually what you said is really interesting, because the idea that a lot of people have that same sort of path where we might grow up in Christianity, and then all of a sudden, as we come into our adulthood, we kind of question it. The exact same thing happened with me. And I think what's nice about that is it speaks against the genetic fallacy. I mean, there's a genetic fallacy. People say, oh, well, you were born in the United States, therefore you'll be a Christian because the majority of people are Christians. And so that's what's going to happen. But so many of us actually are raised in Christianity, but then as we get into adulthood, we question it. We say, is this the right faith? I'm just not sure. And I think that's a good thing that we do that. And then we realize, we go one way or the other.
No, I agree with you there. I think, it would be foolish for somebody to simply believe something just because of where they were raised or how they were raised growing up, that it's okay. And I think that's one of the things, that some Christians might be scared of, about questioning what they believe, but we should be open and honest enough to follow the evidence where it leads. And I think it's a faith builder to do that. And if you don't do that, it could be, it could end up being something that actually stalls your faith and doesn't help you grow your faith. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, and the other thing you said that I want to highlight is I want to thank you for your service in the Marine Corps. I think that's really awesome. The way you went to Iraq. I think actually I've met a few people who went into the military, and sometimes that challenged you in such a way that you see such horrific atrocities in the war. I mean, they say war is hell, that I think a lot of people do even question whether God exists because they see such horrific conditions. And so I think that might be a time. And did you, when you were in the Marine Corps, did you encounter other people who are struggling to keep their faith in God because what they've seen?
Um, you know, it's really weird. Number one, trying to recall those conversations from so many years ago, but number two, faith really wasn't something, at least in my experience with the guys that I was with, it wasn't something that was often talked about or referenced. So I really don't know if any of the guys that I served with had that struggle, because it just for us, it just wasn't talked about. Kind of the MO was, wake up, complete a mission, and that's one more day closer to being home. Now, certainly there were guys that would go to, services that were on base, things like that, but I don't ever recall having that type of conversation. Were the guys that did it? I would probably say, were there guys that went through that? I would probably say yes. There probably were. It just wasn't talked about.
Yeah, I understand that. That's interesting. So if you had to say, and you said you had an emotional experience that sort of brought you in, do you want to detail that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it was just, really as a young person, you just kind of evaluate who you are, and you evaluate, the gospel, and you find yourself um, around like-minded uh, people, and really you just, it's one of those things where you hear the gospel message and you can't really explain it. You're drawn to it, and I think there were a couple of things that took place um, in my life. I think being adopted was one of them. Growing up, I had a lot of animosity towards my biological family, my biological parents, mom and dad. The whole thing of, how could, if you love somebody, how could you abandon them? So that sense of abandonment, and then hearing the gospel and looking at the ethic of Jesus and how he interacted with people who were the downtrodden, who were the rejected, the fact that he dined with sinners, as that was something that said, I have this animosity and this struggle with this aspect of my life, but I see that, this is something different over here in the gospel, and I'm drawn to that. So that was a at least a pillar of that emotional um, experience or drawing towards God and the gospel. So yeah.
I'm sorry. Very cool. I said, I
No,
can hear
you're
my
okay.
neighbors doing some sort of a trimming over there. I know there's some construction going on across the street.
Yeah,
So if
I
you hear that,
can't hear it, so
oh, good.
I think
Okay.
you're good to
Okay.
go. So
I'm starting to
so
get
yeah.
worried about that. Oh no. But okay, so if you had to say, now you and I have, we're both on the same page with, we call ourselves either apologists or
Yeah.
apologetics and that kind of thing. If you had to say that you thought there was one particular argument that you found pretty convincing in theism, what would you
Hmm.
say that was? And you can mention more than one argument if you
No,
think.
that's fine. I would have to say my favorite, and the one that I find to be most convincing, would probably be the Kalam cosmological argument. It was one of the first arguments that I was exposed to. Actually, the first two people that I was ever exposed to on the Christian apologetics side of the house. Well, let me go with three. It was Lee Strobel, C.S. Lewis, and William Lane Craig. And I was exposed to the Kalam, actually doing a thesis at Biola on it. I can get into that a little bit more, but I just find that to be a convincing argument. I find that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Is a pretty, in my opinion, a pretty airtight, uh, logically valid and sound argument. So that's the one that I find. And plus, it's not only logically valid, but I also think contemporary uh, cosmology and science backs that up as far as each one of those premises, specifically 1 and 2.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I like William Lane Craig too. And I know that that was actually, I think it's part of his dissertation,
Mm-hmm.
the Kalam cosmological argument. So that's a strong one. So does that mean that you're an old Earth creationist?
Um, no, not necessarily. I'm actually going through a little bit of a recalibration. I've, every so often in my walk, I like to reconsider um, positions that I have, obviously, because I think self-evaluation and spiritual evaluation is needed. So right now, I'm actually working through the book called The Genesis Debate, and it lays out the old Earth, the young Earth, and the framework view. And so I'm actually working through that book right now, and I'm trying to keep an open mind. I would say that I'm currently young Earth as a matter of how do I want to frame it? As a matter of it being a miracle, not necessarily because I can point to a specific thing that says the Earth is young. I really haven't studied that much young Earth creationist. I just take the text at face value. But that's also a reason why I'm going back and looking at it again, because I don't know that simply holding that, not simply holding that, I certainly want to be grounded to the scripture, but I also want to understand the scripture with its full weight and its full context. So I'm going back and looking at that. So at this point, I'm a young Earth creationist, simply due to the fact that it's a miracle and the text says it. But I'm going to go back and look at it to see if there's anything that I've missed. So yeah.
Okay, that's interesting to know, because I didn't realize, I actually honestly didn't realize that you could hold the position of the Kalam cosmological argument but still support the young Earth. So I suppose what that means is you'd look at the Big Bang, but you would think that God put sort of a fast forward on it.
Well, I would look at it, this way, is that I would think that the Kalam would hold, and I could be wrong. The Kalam would hold whether you were an old Earth or a young Earth, because it simply says that whatever has a beginning has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So whether that's 6 literal days or 13.4 billion years, there's still the beginning there. So and I don't necessarily know that, given the scientific evidence that we have about the background radiation, or Einstein's predictions with regards to general relativity, or Hubble looking through the telescope, or Hubble's discovery, um, confirming kind of what Lemaitre and Friedman predicted. I don't necessarily know that if I hold to those, that necessarily makes me a old earther. I think that stuff could still potentially hold even if you were young Earth. And I, once again, I said I could be wrong. But the Kalam simply notes that the universe began to exist. It doesn't specifically say or give a time frame for that. Now, if the Kalam said uh, whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist 13.4 billion years ago, then that might strap my position down. But I don't necessarily think that it does.
Okay, that's fair
And
enough.
and
'Cause
and the
I
other
honestly
reason, and I
didn't know
use
that,
that,
I didn't know that view so much. So I'm
yeah. Well,
curious.
I use that in general with both young Earth and old Earth creationists and atheists, because I think um, the tactic that I use in talking about the Kalam um, is to try and meet the skeptic where they are. And most skeptics are not young Earth. So if I enter into a conversation, and once again, this is just my apologetic, not necessarily anybody else's. If I enter into a conversation with a skeptic who believes the Earth is old, and the first conversation that we have is actually it's 6 to 10,000 years old, you're wrong about the 13.4 billion. Well, right off the bat, we're going to be doing this. But if I can look at him or her and I can say, all right, let me grant you that, for the sake of argument, let me grant you that the universe is 13.4 billion years old, um, and you believe in the Big Bang, you still a creator, I believe. And we can go. Then that's when you can posit the Kalam to show that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make
Okay,
sense.
cool.
That,
But that's
that
my favorite. Yeah.
yeah, so that's good. So the young Earth position that you're taking is it could be between 6 and 10,000 years, because I have heard some people kind of locking in the 6,000 year period that someone had come up with at one point. But you
Yeah,
said you're a little
I've
more
heard both.
flexible on that.
I've heard between 6 and 10. I once again, just because of the position that I take, I'm not necessarily locked into 6 or 10. I just take, number one, um, the what the text says, in my, understanding that it's a miracle that happens in Genesis chapter 1. So once again, I would freely admit that I'm not specifically well versed in the defense of young Earth creationism per se. I hold it as a confident trust in God and in what the text says. So once again, that's why I'm going back and looking at it to see if I've missed something.
Oh,
So
I think that's good. I think that's good. And you mentioned that you have been to Biola, and I actually, as of all the universities in the United States, I happen to notice that Biola seems to be like the hub of Christian apologetics activities, because you have Sean McDowell there, William Lane Craig, um,
J.P.
J. Warner
Moreland,
Wallace.
Jay
Who
Warner,
else?
yep.
Yeah, it's like
J.P.
I would love
Moreland,
to go
Clay
out there.
Jones, Craig Hazen, um, um, just Ken Samples has been out there before. John Mark Reynolds has been out there before. Paul Copan, Greg Kokel. I mean, Scott Ray is out there. I mean, it really is the hub, which is really cool for me because where I live is literally 15 minutes down the road from SES, where Norman Geisler and Frank Turek and all those guys uh, have either served or graduated from. And so I'm 15 minutes down the road from SES, and then I attend Biola, so I got the best of both worlds. So
How do you attend
yeah.
Biola when you're in? Because that means you're in North
they
Carolina,
they
right?
have a distance learning program for their MA in apologetics.
Oh, I
So
didn't know that.
you do a online portion one semester, and then you go out for residency in the summer, and then you finish up that same first semester in the second semester. So for instance, like just this semester, I took philosophy, religion, ECD 1 and 2, along with scripture, canon, authority. So we started it in the spring. You do your spring session, then you go out for lecture and residency in the summer, and then you finish it up in the fall.
Wow,
So
well, that's a
you
pretty good
should
deal.
you should look into it. You should do it.
Actually, I probably will, because I actually feel like I
Good.
don't have, I'm missing the foundation. I don't have it and I need it.
It's
So,
well worth it, and I would suggest to every person who's looking into, shoring up apologetics, even if you don't want to do the degree, you can still do. They still have um, seminars that go on out there. Uh, I think every semester. So
but do they have online seminar, like when you said you're doing it online, are there seminars online, or is it just sort of a
yeah,
deal where
you pay for the seminar, and you can either go out there physically, or they can link you into a live stream.
that's pretty nice. I like that.
So
That's actually
it's
very
awesome.
entrepreneurial of them. It's a really good idea, because it's
Yeah,
a
no
way
doubt.
to bring Christianity to people who might not be able to live in
Yep.
California for a while.
Yep. Absolutely. So
Very nice.
so
Very nice.
yeah, I
Yeah,
get
you have,
the
'cause you live near my friend Heather Schultz. I don't know if you know her. Do you know her on
I
Twitter
do
too?
not. I do not. I guess I should.
Yeah, she calls herself Lady Apologist.
Okay. Okay.
And she's
Awesome.
over at SES. So she's always putting the events on SES, posting them up and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's good. That's
Gotcha.
great. So is there any other theist argument that you think is pretty strong that
Um, I like I also like the fine tuning argument. And maybe it's just because I'm a sucker for the cosmos. I don't know. Which basically says, the fine tuning of the universe is due to chance, necessity, or design. It's not due to necessity or chance. Therefore, it's due to design. Once again, theist argument, general case for God, not necessarily getting you to Christianity, but I really like that argument given the super fine range of in which the cosmological constants and quantities fall. Seems to, in a general sense, seems to indicate fine tuning and design. So those
Yeah.
are my two. Those are two that I really like.
Have you
And
read Hugh Ross's books? Have you read any of his materials?
I've got Hugh Ross's book. What is it? The Creator and the Cosmos.
Yeah.
I've also got. I'm looking over at my shelf right now. I've got The Privileged Planet, which I worked through a long time ago.
I haven't read that
Um,
one.
yeah, Privileged Planet is by Gonzalez and J. Wright Richards. And then I also have on the other end, what is that book? It's by Paul Davies. I can't see the title from here. I need to get my glasses adjusted. But I've got a Paul Davies book. Paul Davies is agnostic, I believe, and he talks about origins of life and the fine tuning of the universe, so to speak. What else do I have over there? I have From Eternity to Here by Sean Carroll, which is I'm actually using that pretty heavily for my thesis. But I've got
Isn't Sean Carroll an agnostic too, or am I wrong about that?
Sean Carroll, I believe, is an atheist.
Okay.
I believe he's an atheist. I also have Alexander Vilenkin's Many Worlds in One, which is an interesting read. He's an agnostic too. So yeah, I try and balance stuff out with my apologetics. Try and read both sides of it.
Do they encourage that at Biola in your degree that you're
Absolutely,
taking?
absolutely, and I think we should encourage that as much as possible, so that we can get a well balanced breakfast, so to speak. It's funny. I'll share this story. When I was first here, landed in North Carolina. I was in my office and I was rereading The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and a lady from the church walked into my office and she goes, "Oh my goodness, what are you doing?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She goes, "Are you becoming an atheist?" I said, "No, I'm not becoming an atheist. What would make you think that?" She's like, "You're reading Richard Dawkins. Why are you reading Richard Dawkins?" And I said, "Well, if I want to refute Richard Dawkins, I got to know what the man thinks." So I'm a big proponent of reading both the literature that I agree with, or the people that I agree with, and also the people that I don't agree with. I find Christopher Hitchens to be not. I mean, certainly Hitchens was very crude, but I also find him to be kind of funny too.
Oh, he was very good in debates. I haven't read his
Yeah.
books yet, and I have read Dawkins. I read the God Delusion too,
Mm-hmm.
but he was very good in debates, and he was funny. Like he was able to come up with things really off the cuff that were pretty funny.
Yeah. So
so he has that going for him, or he had that going for him. So so he was probably in a way a little bit charismatic. Have you caught up with his brother at all, Peter Hitchens?
I haven't followed Peter Hitchens that much. To be honest, I think the last thing that I saw of him, he did a debate. Last thing I saw of Peter Hitchens was certainly he's probably been more active, but the last thing I saw was him do a conversation at it was either Oxford or Cambridge in favor of theism. So I just haven't kept up with him that much. So.
Yeah, he's got a. In case anyone's wondering, he can be reached on Twitter at Clark Micah, ClarkeMicah, and his tweets are actually pretty funny. He's got some political stuff, but he also every once in a while he starts talking about Christopher, his brother, and it gets kind of hairy because if you don't know, if you're just tuning in, Peter is both Christopher and Peter were raised originally Christian. both of them went off to be atheists for a while, and then Peter came back and became a Christian and wrote a book called Rage Against God. And it's actually a pretty good book. But he talks about when he was raging against God, how he just kind of loved it because he could do whatever he wanted, you know, in life, just do anything he wanted, and he felt like there was going to be no one holding him accountable. So he had this sort of and he said, unfortunately, he had a few lost years because of that. So he kind of made it kind of funny.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. So now if we had to go back to argue, because last night I spent a little time talking to Apologia about Jesus Christ and some arguments in support of Christianity and the resurrection and the crucifixion and that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about, I mean, are there any compelling arguments in your mind to tell people when they say, you know, why your God? Why not? There's 3,000 other gods out there. I'm sure you've heard this. 3,000 other gods out there. Why should we follow your God?
So it seems like we're moving from just general theism to Christianity. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I really think the best case for Christianity is the thing that you debated last night with Apologia is the resurrection. I mean, Paul says, not Apologia, Paul the apostle. He says,
Apologia is now Sologia.
gotcha. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that if the resurrection is not true, then our faith is futile. And so it seems to me that if it's true, and this is just a cliche tautology, but if it's true, it's true. And so I find the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection, to be pretty compelling. In light of the work of guys like Habermas, Lacona, Craig Blomberg, Craig Evans, Dan Wallace, guys who have done New Testament studies, things like that. I find their work to be pretty compelling in the realm of Jesus studies and also resurrection studies as well. So.
Yeah, I do too. And you mentioned Lee Strobel before, and I think
Yeah, Lee
he
Strobel.
came to our church a few years ago, and he brought. We all got a copy of A Case for Easter. He showed up for Easter actually, so we all got a copy
Cool.
of A Case for Easter, and it's a great book. And so, do you find? I mean, which out of those authors that you mentioned, if someone were to come to you and say, "Listen, I only have money for one book," which one would you recommend?
Oh man.
Like I've only got a few.
That might be the toughest question you asked me today because I love all those authors. It really would depend on the person, I guess. If the person is someone who's saying, "Hey, I'm just starting to try and introduce myself to really get the basics of the case for the resurrection," what would you suggest? I'd say Lee Strobel, A Case for Christ. If it's someone who is more looking for something that's more academically rigorous, I would go with Lacona. His book, I just had it. I don't know where I put it. His book on the resurrection is it was his dissertation for his PhD, and it's over 600 pages long.
Oh wow!
I mean, he does. It's it's the resurrection historiographical approach. Sorry, Mike, if I butchered the title of that, but if he's gonna watch this at some point. But I mean, it goes super in depth, even before you get into the historical bedrock of the case for the resurrection. He talks about horizons, which basically is our filters and things like that. That all of us have a certain filter when we come to certain topics and subjects and things like that. And then he gets into pretty much everything that you guys talked about last night, or anything that anybody's ever talked about when it comes to the resurrection. He will address that, and it's really, really good book. I would suggest anybody, if you're looking for an in-depth.
Oh shoot! He froze up a little bit. I don't know where he went. I think we're still on. Can you hear us in the chat? I don't know. We might have Just lost Dean for a second there. I'll see if he comes back. You just wait a second. So I want to say, I guess while I'm waiting for Dean to come back, unless it's just me that's being heard, can you hear me? Stickman, I see you out there. Colonel's Crazy Adventure and Rawl Rexsaurus. Can you guys hear me? I'm gonna type that in. Okay, I'll see if you guys can hear me. Okay, good. Okay, thank you. So I don't know what happened to Dean, but I'm sure he'll come back. Thank you, all of you who are in the chat. We are going to take some questions if you guys want to ask some of your tough questions. I can see I've got 2 atheists at least in the chat because I can kind of tell by the questions and things you're asking that you might be an atheist. So so if you have questions that you want to pose to us, we're certainly going to answer those as best we can. If we can, we'll certainly try. So I'm just going to wait for Dean to come back. But while I do that, I guess, oh wait, I think Dean's popping out and popping back, it looks like. So maybe he's going to try to get back in here. If you're in the chat and if you had to pick out of the different arguments that we laid out, so we talked about the cosmological argument and we talked about the fine tuning. So those are 2 pretty strong arguments. Oh,
all right, I'm back. I'm sorry. My bad. I temporarily lost connection.
I saw that. Well, I was like, I wonder if I lost connection too. So I guess I didn't. But while you were gone, and just to Rawl Rexsaurus, he's in the chat. I said, can you ask us a question so we have something to talk about? And so he just asked, how do you explain the diversity of life? And I have a theory on that, but I wanted to see, did you want to answer that?
Sorry, what was the question? I got kind of muddled.
He says, how do you explain the diversity of life?
I have no problem, in principle with the idea of, microevolution. I would probably say on this topic, I hold heavy to intelligent design with regards to that. So once again, diversity of life studies, evolution studies, not necessarily my personal forte. I'm more philosophical, historical guy, but I think that what Behe and Dembski and those guys laid out as far as the mechanics of, actually Behe's got a new book coming out soon, the mechanics of evolution. I would also promote Doug Axe's Undeniable book as well. The mechanics of evolution, I think what you see is that, sure, I think evolution happens on a micro level, but I just don't know if you can get there on the macro level. So you could certainly have, for instance, 2 dogs that are different species mate and create a different species of dog, right? And I think that over time you could get different types of dogs. But I think one of the issues that the evolutionist is going to have a problem with is the Cambrian explosion. So if you're looking at the long view of this, basically what Stephen C. Meyer talks about in Darwin's Doubt is the Cambrian explosion is the point where all current body planes that are known come into existence, and there's no evolutionary trail backwards. Basically, there's no evidence of an ancestor pre those body planes, things like trilobites, things like that. And so the question is, what's the best explanation for that? And he goes on to say it's not Darwin's theory of evolution, but he would say intelligent design. So that's the best answer I have with the limited scope of information available to me with regards to evolution. So yeah.
No, I like that. I like that. And you came up with even some authors so you recommended. So that's very good. So and actually that reminds me of Hugh Ross's book when he looks at, because we talked about a little bit about young Earth and old Earth creationists, and Hugh Ross tends to lean towards the old Earth idea. Mm-hmm. But one thing that he said that I think is kind of interesting is he looked at the 7 days of creation, and he noticed how each day, each of these periods has a beginning and an end, like a morning and an evening. And each day they say that, except for on the seventh day, the evening is never sighted. So his theory is that we're in the seventh day right now. And he looks back to, he looks at the fact that you can say that when were the last can't talk. When did the last large mammals evolve? And he can say that no, there's really not too much going on in the past thousands of years, recent thousands of years, because he thinks that we're in God's period of rest, where he's not busy being the being behind a lot of the evolution. So
that's interesting. I have never heard that, but I definitely want to look at that. I'll read. What book is this? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but does
oh
he
no, I read
that?
a bunch of his books. I read the one that you have, Creator in the Cosmos.
Does he mention that in the Creator in the Cosmos?
I don't think he does. I know he's got it in, it's in his book, Improbable Planet. That's one of them. And there's another book that he does on Genesis, and I'm forgetting exactly what the title is, but Hugh Ross Genesis. And actually, even if you don't want to pay for his books, you can go into reasonstobelieve.org. And he's got a lot of stuff on his website where you can just read articles there. So that's even easier. Gotcha. So
I'll do that.
Yeah. And good to see everybody in the chat. I see my name. They're asking questions and I don't know. I'm not any expert at all in evolution. So I'm actually kind of uncomfortable talking about it most of the time, but I can see there's people asking more questions on evolution. So I would have to study up on that before being able to give a really good response. But let's go back to what happened before you were cut off a little while ago. So I think you were talking about people like Lee Strobel and bringing up some authors like that, and maybe like Lacona.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend, because in order to get Lacona and maybe even N.T. Wright's more theologically invested in his work on the resurrection than Lacona is. Lacona is looking at it from this perspective of, all right, is this history, whereas Wright is more along the lines of how does the theology of the resurrection, how should that impact the Christian life? So I would say before you get to Lacona and Wright, read Strobel would be my first suggestion as well. So, and the same thing would go, I would say Strobel's A Case for God is a good primer before you get into somebody like Craig or Moreland on theistic arguments for the existence of God, because Strobel will really lay a good primer groundwork so that once you're there, from Strobel's case for God, I would then probably move to something like Mere Christianity or On Guard by William Lane Craig, and then I would move to, after you've got a grip on that or can understand that, I'd move to something like Philosophy of Religion book by Yandel or William Lane Craig. You can't go wrong with William Lane Craig, in my opinion. So.
No, you can't. And you can get on his stuff for free on reasonablefaith.org. So you can go into his stuff. I actually have two of his books too. I've got On Guard, and I've got the his main book. Shoot, what's it called?
Reasonable Faith.
Yeah, Reasonable. Yep. So I just named the website. Yeah, it's Reasonable Faith. So I have that book, and that's a big Mac fat book. I mean, the On Guard is this little book, and Reasonable Faith is like taking that to the next level as far as philosophical scholarship and that kind of thing. So
cool.
But I would agree with you. It's funny because I kind of came to the same path. I started off in my church. I think it was about 2012. Strobel came and spoke to us at Easter, and that was my sort of beginner step. And then I was still not totally sold on Christianity, and it wasn't until I sat next to a pastor on a plane and he told me to read Mere Christianity that I was completely sold. I mean, C.S. Lewis did it for me. And then I read books like Frank Turek, and I went off into Plantinga, and I read off into Hugh Ross. I read those all about the same time. Hugh Ross' Improbable Planet was my first Hugh Ross book. And then I just got addicted and started buying books
Mhm.
like crazy. So now I've got this ridiculous
There,
bookshelf. My
there you
husband was
go.
going to give me a bookshelf, but instead he got me a Yeti. But he was going to give me
There
a
you
bookshelf.
go.
I'm like, I
There you
have
go.
so many books downstairs. I have like they're crowded in this thing, like two levels, and it's crazy.
Nice. Well, I hope to. Uh, I don't know what I'm gonna do if I ever move from Gastonia. These books are gonna be. I'm gonna have to put them in like a gun safe so that they don't get messed up. Is what I've always told my wife.
Guns. And do you actually have guns? I guess in
No,
Gastonia you would have guns, right?
I don't.
Oh, you
I
don't?
don't have
Okay.
them. Nope,
Well, I
I
never
don't.
know. I mean, I'm in Florida. My
Oh,
neighbor's
okay.
in a military neighborhood. Everybody has a gun.
Yeah, everybody's got it.
Us,
Gotcha.
but
So.
okay. So I wanted to ask you. We were going to talk about also what are the tough, and because you've been reading some of these atheist and agnostic books, what do you think some
Mhm.
of their biggest challenges to Christianity are? Like, what are the toughest questions you've seen where you've kind of struggled to answer?
Um, man, um, I think the number one thing that's often brought up with regards to Christianity, um, is issues of ethics in the Old Testament. Specifically, the number one thing that I come across is the command to drive the Canaanites out of the land, and what people have a tendency to say is that God commanded that the Israelites kill all men, women, and children in the land of Canaan. But that's not the specific command given to Joshua. The specific command given to Joshua is to drive them out of the land. And it seems that in the text, the only people that were killed were the ones who stayed back to fight. So, secondly, the issue that I have with that is not with that specific command. The issue that I have with the atheist position or the skeptic's position is there's a presupposition as though the Canaanites were great people. There's a presupposition that they were simply innocent, and they weren't. These were people who, in their worship to the god Baal, on their children on altars alive. And as Josephus records that the people in the land of Canaan would bang their drums as loud as possible so that they couldn't hear the screams of their children. And what's what's always interesting to me is that on the one hand, the skeptic says, "Why doesn't God do anything about evil?" And then on the other hand, we see that God does something about evil with the Canaanites, and the skeptic throws their hands up and says, wait, he's not supposed to do anything about evil, but then why does he do something about evil, right? So that seems to be an inconsistency from my vantage point in the skeptical position. But I don't think that the driving out of the Canaanites from the land is a genocide. I don't think it qualifies as that at all.
Yeah, and actually, I wrote a blog on that, and I got nicknamed Genocide Glenda thanks to my blog, and because
Yeah.
I said that actually I'll recommend Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? Really good book, and William Lane Craig recommended that, and actually William Lane Craig has a bunch of videos on this on Canaanite, and so does, and I see Slammed in here is also recommending Mike Winger, but he's got some nice videos on this whole issue with Canaanites and that kind of thing, and it's true, like what you said. I didn't realize though that Josephus mentioned the whole idea with the banging of the drums. I had heard that and I couldn't find where the source came from. So is that in Antiquities?
I believe it's in his Antiquities, but don't quote me on it. But
Okay.
he records that, and so the issue with the Canaanites is God allowed to punish evil, and if God's allowed to punish evil, then I don't see why the atheist would uh, object to that, given the text doesn't indicate that men, women, and children were killed. We actually see an instance with Rahab in which they had every right to go and kill Rahab, and they didn't.
Yeah, so actually, I think you're bringing up a good point. So God gave the Canaanites a warning, and I would assume that many of the women, children, older men, very young kids, boys would have left, and they would have left just the people who wanted to fight back on the land to protect the land. And the idea was that God told them to drive out the Canaanites. So I agree with you on that. He didn't say go in there and just burn them all to death. He said drive them off that land because this is the promised land for you.
Yeah, and even on the other point, and the other piece to this puzzle in the land of Canaan are the Amalekites, in which God does seem to indicate, hey, kill all men, women, and children. But 2 points with regards to the Amalekites. Number one, the Amalekites were a thorn in Israel's flesh, even before they decided to drive the people out in the land of Canaan. While they're in the wilderness in the book of Exodus, Amalek comes out to pillage and plunder Israel. So number one, with regards to the Amalekites, still in the same boat as the Canaanites, not nice people, not it's not like the Amalekites were the Brady Bunch, so to speak, right? But number two, the more that I look at it and the more that I read Copan and the language, is that this could be hyperbole, in the same way that, so you're not an Alabama fan, are you?
No, they lost. I know Clemson won last night,
Okay,
right?
so Alabama got smoked last night by Clemson. And so certainly there will be people on the radio today that say the Clemson Tigers slaughtered Alabama last night, right? Now, that doesn't mean that as we were watching the national championship game last night, Trevor Lawrence, the quarterback for Clemson, went around and literally stabbed and killed every single member of Alabama, right? Or sure, Dabo Sweeney probably said to his boys, "All right, let's go out there and crush them, or let's go out there and kill them, or hey, once we get our foot on their throat, we're not going to let up." Right? He doesn't mean that literally, right? He means that figuratively. And so one of the keys that we can see that this is possibly hyperbole is that God, communicating to people in their language, in their context, in their culture. This is also something that is seen in the ancient Near East. This type of language is seen from other leaders in the Mesopotamian area. God says, "God there and crush them," right? And so the problem the skeptic's going to have to say, or going to have to deal with, is God makes this command, and if the skeptic is going to say that this is absolutely 100% a command to kill all men, women, and children, then they have to also respect the issue of there were literally men, women, and children later down the line because Israel intermarried with the same people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense because what you're saying is they didn't annihilate them. Obviously, there were some left.
Yeah, there were some left. If there were none left, then how you can't intermarry with people that are no longer living.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to God. Also said if there are any good people, He wasn't going to remove them. He waited 400 years basically before they were in such a terrible condition morally that He figured there was no hope. And I think another
Yeah.
thing I wanted to bring up that somebody else had brought up, actually Lisa Quintana, she's also a really good, Lisa Q she goes by, but she had written a blog that's really excellent on blood
Mm-hmm.
retribution. And the idea is if you didn't destroy everybody, the kids would come back and eventually kill you because they have this blood retribution.
Yeah, and I'm just looking in the chat. There seems to be a thing about, could God have educated the Canaanites properly instead of having them genocided? Number one, once again, it's not a genocide. But number two, as Rahab recalls in her encounter with Israel, she recalls hearing about the Israelites, if I'm correct. She recalls about hearing about who they were, what they were about. Um, so so it's not as if Israel is some mysterious foreign nation in the land. The surrounding tribes and city states know about Israel. They know about they probably know about Yahweh. But two, who's to say that even if they were properly educated, that they would still have come into a relationship with Yahweh? That doesn't seem to be the indication. People who are at the point of depravity that they would burn their own children in worship to Baal, um, it seems to me that it may not matter how much education they get. We see other instances of this in Scripture. We see the maybe not a one for one comparison, but we see that Jesus does multiple miracles for the Pharisees. They call him a blasphemer. We see that Moses with Pharaoh, God offers the plagues as and even instances where Aaron's rod turns into a serpent and takes out the other two serpents. It doesn't matter what Moses and Aaron do in that situation, Pharaoh does not move from his position. So to simply say, well, if God would have properly educated them, then they would have turned from their ways, that's a presupposition that isn't necessarily valid. Just because there's an education doesn't mean that there's a correction.
Yeah, and I do find it curious because I do find that at least some of the atheists I talk to seem to be okay with the idea of abortion, even abortion in a relatively mid-term pregnancies, not late term. I think most people are against late-term abortions once the baby's viable, but before that, when the baby isn't viable quite yet, they might be okay with the idea of abortion, but yet they're completely against the idea of the death penalty and capital punishment. And I find that kind of an interesting seems like a dichotomy a little bit. So you're okay with the innocent being killed, but you're not okay with the completely guilty being killed. So it's kind of a strange thing.
Yeah, I'll let the skeptics answer that one. I'm not going to necessarily answer for them, but I think you make up I think you bring up at least something to consider from their perspective. So
Yeah.
it
So
is interesting to me.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it is interesting to me that when we say that we want to play God, it's okay, but when God gets to play God, it's not okay. I'll put it that way. So.
Yeah, there's only, and I think C.S. Lewis puts it so well. He's kind of like, okay, there's one God. God is God, and you are not. He doesn't need a bunch of mini gods walking around. I forget how he put it very eloquently, and I'm just trying to slaughter his words, but but I always like that. So I think that you're right. The Old Testament can be a challenge because I think we're trying to take our lens of the current culture and trying to look at the old culture, and a lot of people have a lot of issues with slavery in the Old Testament too. And they'll look at antebellum slavery and they'll try to put that lens on the horrific sort of slavery that we had here in the United States. And they'll apply it back to the biblical slavery, where a lot of people actually voluntarily went into what they called servitude, and they acted as servants. And if they were Hebrew, they were given a maximum amount of time they could be considered a servant or a slave. So, but that's another big argument that I see.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, real quick, let me navigate my Bible real quick. Yeah, so here's the one of the issues in which bothers me because we don't use it. It doesn't seem that apologists use it. It's clear from the context of history that in the time of Jesus, as far as slavery goes, it was more of an indentured servitude to pay off debt, to gain money if you were poor, something like that. But notice what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 7. And what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians is he's dealing with a group of people who are extremely divided. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, they're divided over who baptized them. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14 deals with spiritual gifts. And in 13, he pauses in the middle there, obviously, to say, hey, focus on love. And then you have certain people before that who were obsessed about marriage and the conditions that they found themselves in. And one of the overarching principles we see in the New Testament is that if you're so worried about where you are physically, you'll miss the overarching mission and call of the gospel. So he's speaking to slaves, who indentured servants, and he says here, each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. Meaning, don't be so concerned about where you are that you miss the opportunity to be a good example as a Christian. But notice what he says here. He says, don't be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself to the opportunity. So there's no carte blanche, Paul saying, if you're a slave, you've got to stay a slave. He's saying, if you can gain your freedom, do it. And that's something that a lot of apologists, I personally think, miss in these discussions, is if we want to have a talk about slavery in the New Testament or the time of Jesus, and we're going to say, all right, well, hey, Paul talked about slaves, talks about slaves and freedom, and hey, he tells these people that if they're, slaves, they've got to stay slaves. Well, he doesn't say that. He says, if you can gain your freedom, go for it. Avail yourself to it. Take the opportunity to be free. So, and that is actually a lifting. That is actually promoting the status of the indentured servant rather than keeping it at the cultural norm. So that's my 2 cents about slavery.
No, and actually, I'll piggyback on that because that's a great point. It's one of the things that's the rule in the Old Testament is if you found a runaway slave, you were supposed to take that person and help them. You weren't supposed to send them back to their owner. So it was a rule if you came upon, and I have the passage over here somewhere, but it's in one of the verses of the Old Testament, and that's different than how it was here in antebellum America. If you found a runaway slave, the idea was people captured them and sent them back to their owners. So the idea is, usually people would leave their owners. I mean, if you're going to be a runaway slave, it's probably because you were being mistreated, maybe even being beaten. So you ran away to get away from it. So the idea is now you have to take these people, harbor them, help them, make sure they're okay.
Well, to piggyback back on that, in the letter of Philemon, as Paul writes, to Philemon about Onesimus, a runaway slave, right? Notice what he says. He says here, I prefer to do nothing without your consent, in order that your goodness might not be by compulsion, but of your own accord. For this perhaps is why he was parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And then he says in verse 21, confident of your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you will do even more than I say. At the same time, prepare a guest room for me, for I'm hoping that through your prayers I'll be graciously given to you. So what does he say to Philemon? Hey, he's parted from you, he's running away from you, and I want you to not just have him back as a bondservant, but have him back as a brother. And Paul, knowing the character of Philemon, says, I'm confident that you're going to do even more than what I say. So Paul doesn't say, when he gets back, beat him to death for running away. He says, hey, when he comes back to you, you're to view him as an equal and as a brother in Christ. So I think those two passages, 1 Corinthians 7, I think it's 21, and then the letter to Philemon, illustrate to us that the ethical standard for the indentured servant is substantially higher than under the cultural norm of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we kind of addressed some of the what they call genocide, In the
Yeah.
Mennonites, we've talked a little bit about slavery. One other thing that I get a lot, this question comes up a lot, and this is with Jesus. And I have a way that I answer this, or I think about answering this, but I'm curious to see what you say. What do you say when people come up and they say, you're supposed to hate your mother? Jesus said you hate your mother and you hate your father and you hate your brothers and that kind of thing. And there's a verse that's, I think, in Matthew that mentions that. How do you respond to that particular challenge?
Yeah, what Jesus is talking about there in the language is a comparative, is comparative language, that in comparison to your love for me, it would seem as though you hate your mother, your brother, your father, your mother, that your love for me should outweigh the love that you have for the closest relationships in your life. And the language is, I think, clear in that. Because even if you want to get even more technical, the word there simply means to love less. Literally means to love less. So, in order for you to be my disciple, you have to love your mother less in comparison to me by your love. Their relationship can't be so dominant that it distracts you from following me, right? And we see that um, even in Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul talks to them, be imitators of God, right? And he says, what? Don't do things that, and I'm paraphrasing here, rough paraphrase, don't be people of the darkness if you're proclaiming to be people of the light. James says, can a spring, bring forth both fresh and salt water, right? You can't be people of the dark and hang around people of the dark and be influenced by people of the dark if you're proclaiming to be someone of the light. So in the same way, he's saying there, you can't, your family dynamic can't outweigh your love for me.
Yeah, and I like that. I didn't realize the word translated. I'm gonna have to go back and look at that Hebrew word and dig into that, because that'd actually be a good blog to write. Because
There you go.
I've never gone into that one. That's actually I like that topic. That's good. I heard a really good video by Inspiring Philosophy. I don't know if you follow him at all, Mike, on the book
Yeah.
of Job. Because that's also, atheists always talk to me about the book of Job, and they said, Job is this great guy and he did a lot of great things. So why would God, play this game with the devil and allow the devil to basically attack Job? And so, have you given any thought to that? Because I can tell you what IP came up with, but
Yeah. I think one of the purposes, and this is an overarching topic with regards to suffering, is that I think, and I even think the skeptic would agree with me, that suffering can be beneficial. Overarching suffering can be beneficial. I also think that Job serves as an example um, to not only Job's friends but also us, that even when we're not sure what is going on, the overarching narrative of that is that we are to trust God. We know at the end of Job that Job wants to know why he's suffering, but he never gets an answer. And the point there in Job is not that you're going to get an answer for every reason why you suffer, but that you're to trust God even though you may not know what's going on. As to why, I think Job is a type to Jesus. I think that Satan's, um, you know, I guess messing. I don't want to say messing. It's more than just messing with Job, but Satan's interaction with Job is a type that foreshadows Jesus and the temptation in the wilderness as well. So that's just what I have on it. I could be, like once said, I'm open to other possibilities.
yeah, no, I like that. And it reminds me, because it actually does fit in with what IP came up with. And he came up with the idea of, he compared Job to Abraham, and he said Abraham and Job were very much alike. They were both doing very good works. However, in the Bible, apparently it mentions Job, and it didn't mention how he walked in the way of the Lord, but it says that Abraham was walking in the way of the Lord. In other words, Abraham also had faith. So the
Mm-hmm.
idea of having the faith, just like you said, having the trust, is pretty important. So with Job, he was doing all of the works, but he didn't necessarily have faith. And God, this was God's way of building his faith and increasing his faith. And so that was sort of what he went
I
into.
don't want to split hairs with IP, and maybe IP and I can have a conversation about it. But the only, I guess, quibble that I would have about that with regards to Job is that there's a constant phrase that runs throughout Job, and that it says there, a constant phrase, a key phrase in the book of Job is that uh, in all of these things, Job did not sin. So I personally would struggle with saying that Job had a faith issue if when he suffered, um, the text then says, in all these things, Job did not sin. That's just me. I'd be more than happy to even have a private chat with IP about it to see how he arrived at that conclusion. But I'm not going to cause a I'm not necessarily going to cause a war about it. So
Yeah,
yeah.
no, that's I like that. I think that topic's and that topic reminds me of another one that I always was curious about when I was coming into Christianity is the idea of the prodigal son, because it always kind of bothered me. I'm like, okay, there's two sons. There's one guy who's doing all the right things. He's hanging out. And then the other guy goes off and he's just a total goofball. He's over just messing around. Like he went to Vegas and just started spending all the family inheritance, ends up in a brothel in Vegas and comes back. And, the father's so happy to see him. He celebrates, he gets the fattest lamb. He does all this kind of stuff, has this huge celebration. And the other son's kind of like, well, what about me? I mean, I've been here all along working and what are you doing about me? And the guy's like, well, my son's come back. And that always bothered me, but it kind of reminds me of this idea where you can be a little self-righteous. And I think the other son might've been a bit self-righteous. And so something to that effect.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. The older son was self-righteous, and remember, the father reminds him there in that text that all the father has was also his. So there's no need to get bent out of shape about the celebration of your younger brother coming back, because your reward is still your reward. So I think that's I agree that first time you look at that text, you're like, whoa, this is crazy. But once you dig a little bit in there, you can see that the purpose of what the father does both for the son that returned, but also reassuring the older son that what his reward is, he still has.
Yeah, he still has the inheritance of the family. And speaking of inheritance, that's another question that I get asked a lot by atheists. They say, well, what kind of hell do you believe in? What kind of God would send a person to hell for finite sins just because this person didn't want to believe in him?
Yeah, I believe that hell is real, that hell is eternal. And with regards to why would God send somebody to hell, I think it actually comes back to understanding the ethic of love, in that given that love is the highest ethic in the Bible, it demands that love be a choice. And given free will, people have the option to accept God or reject God, and that it would actually be immoral of God to force people into heaven against their will. Right?
Yeah,
So
I
it's
get that way too.
yeah, and so it's not that God sends people uh, to hell; it's that people choose hell by rejecting God. Um, and I personally, I have no problem uh, with God doing that on the basis of two things: free will and love being a choice. And love demands, if you're going to truly love somebody, you have to choose to love them. You can't be forced to love them. That's rape. And so if God forces people to love him, that's spiritual rape. And if he spiritually rapes people, then he's not God. He's not morally good. So
That's an interesting take, and even an interesting word, spiritual rape. I've
well,
never
I mean, I guess and this is a shout out to Doug. I guess I'm funneling my inner Pine Creek, so to speak, by using those terms. I guess not that he's used those terms, but he's at least that bold.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I could see him using that. I was on you saw that. I think did you see the Shannon after show last night?
I did. I was there. I was listening.
Okay, that's right. That's right. I think yeah, because Doug was there. Doug Pine Creek was
Yeah,
there.
I love Doug.
He was asking a lot of his tough questions. So, so I want
Yeah.
to go to the, maybe we should go to the chat and see if I see we have a few people in here. We've got Slammed and
Okay.
Rawl Rexorus. I don't know if they're still there, but let's see if anyone has any questions they want to ask. And Slammed, I just want to say, is recommending a Hugh Ross book called Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. So that sounds like it could be a really good book to read. But if anyone wants to ask a question of the Daily Apologist, he's got some pretty good expertise. How far are you in your MA program, I should ask?
I graduate this upcoming December, and I'm thrilled. This past semester, I took 6 classes, and it about broke me.
6 classes in one semester? Holy cow.
Yeah, my wife came in and she said, "You're to never do that again." And I said, "Don't worry, I won't."
Are they 3 credit hours each? So it's 18 credit
no,
hours?
they're not 3 credit hours each. They're I'm trying to think. It's only like 8 credit hours total that I'm taking, but they're split between the semesters. There's 1 credit in the spring, 1 credit in the fall. So
Yeah.
but
Well, that keeps you busy if you're
still
working on
heavy.
the side too.
Do what? Oh
Are
yeah,
you
and do
working?
all the stuff. Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
am.
So I mean, that's a lot of work. That's a real lot. So I'm looking at the chat and I'm just trying to see. Oh, so Slammed wants to know who you are. Did you want to actually maybe just give everybody another background on how to find you, Dean? And
Yeah, yeah. My name's Dean Meadows. You can obviously find me at Twitter at daily_apologist. We have a Facebook page, The Daily Apologist. There's the YouTube channel, The Daily Apologist. If you want to Facebook friend me, just type in Dean Meadows and I'll accept it so long as you're nice to me. If you're a jerk to me, I'm not gonna. We'll be friends very shortly. But no, yeah, that's basically our www.thedailyapologist.com. You've got videos there, you've got blogs there as well. I'm on Instagram as the Daily Apologist. Shocker, right? So that's how you can find me and locate me. And once again, if you've got a question, you can definitely ask it in the chat. But maybe after the chat's over with, you've got a question, I'll be more than happy to try and answer that. Either message me on Twitter or message me on Facebook. So there you go. Shameless plug. Woohoo!
yeah, it looks like Rawl Rexorus said he subscribed to you already, so you got a new subscriber.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks a lot.
So how long have you
Appreciate
been
it.
doing this, Dean? How long have you been doing
Okay,
apologist?
so as far as my own personal intense study of apologetics, 3 years at Biola. As far as dabbling here and there, probably around 6 years or so. 6 years or so. So I'm fairly new to the game and learning the game of apologetics. Now, I did see. Okay, so there is a question that says there's going to be a lot of good people at the white throne judgment that didn't believe during their lives, but will be more than willing to believe and dedicate their lives to God. I need some clarification as to what that second piece uh, means or what they're trying to get with that. I guess.
I think I could guess what I think they're trying to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a lot of people, and even my especially my dad says this a lot, and they're very, very weak Christians, but my dad always says, hey, if you're a good person, I'm sure that God's going to keep the door open for you. And the challenge with that is it doesn't exactly say that in the Bible. It sort of says you can't just be a good person. There's more that you have to do as far as having a lot of faith.
Yeah,
So
I would suggest one example of that would be Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. We're told that Cornelius is someone of high respect, high reputation, but we also see that high respect and high reputation, it doesn't say before his conversion that he was saved. And so one of the things that I want to caution people that might have that inclination to say, well, there are a lot of good people. it could be that what we're engaging in is we're comparing ourselves by ourselves, right? We're saying that person is good relative to Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, right?
Yeah.
That person's good relative to all of those people, right? But when we look at the text of scripture, we see that we're supposed to be, as people, set apart as God is set apart. And we fail to meet that standard. So, in failing to meet that standard and missing the mark is what sin is, in missing the mark of God's holiness, we're not good. We're not. And so let's make sure that when we make that comparison, we say, well, that person's a good person or that person's a good person, yet they don't believe in God. What's the standard of goodness that you're using? If you're using, because here's the thing, you and I can always find somebody that's worse than us, right?
Yeah. It's
I
not
can
hard.
look on the news and say, I'm not as bad as Kevin Spacey. I'm not as
We
bad as
can
Kevin
always
Spacey.
find someone better than us too. That's the other flip side.
Yeah, yeah. And so I would just say, in making that statement, you have to make sure that when you're saying that person's a good person, number one, what do you mean by that? Number two, what's the comparison? What's the barometer for that you're using that statement in or for? So.
And I think Ralric Source is making a little joke now. He says if you have a common name, like if you're John Smith, your name's going to be found in the Lamb's Book of Life because you got
Nice,
it made in the shade
nice.
pink lemonade if you're named John Smith, because pretty much John
Yeah.
Smith is going to be in the Lamb's Book of Life.
Oh man, that guy. I like. How do you say his name? Raul
Ralric Source,
Rexorus.
looks like.
He's
So.
funny. I
Yeah,
like.
that is funny. So actually, the people who are in the chat, if you guys ever want to come on my channel or you want to come on Daily Apologist or either of us, or maybe we could all come back here and have a big group meeting, I'd love to bring more people in with this. And I really appreciate that you guys have come in here today.
No, if I can make one more point, I'd like to make a. I was in the chat last night after the debate, and there are a couple of things that were said by the panel or during the panel discussion that um, I would like to address if that's okay.
I'd love that. Yeah.
So one of the things that was addressed was about the Gospels, and we say, all right, hey, these things are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. And I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head. I haven't watched it back, but to the effect it was, these are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. Therefore, A, B, C, or D was said. Well, and I mentioned this to you, but that's not necessarily true. Number one, in history, we see that just because a letter or a document is anonymous, it doesn't mean that we don't know who wrote it. For instance, which is why I kind of messed with Shannon today on Twitter about not being a part of the panel. I had to mention this. Plutarch wrote something like 40, I forget the exact number, like 48 to 52 biographies, and the vast majority of them do not have his name assigned to him. They don't, but they're attributed to him by other sources. Um, and so just because a document doesn't have a name on it doesn't mean that we can't know who wrote it. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't have their names on it, but we do see in church history, and church history is just can be just as valid as quote regular history. And so we do have sources relatively close to the time of the writings that attribute these documents to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I would ask the question, what's the benefit? Let's just go ahead and take Matthew for example. What's the benefit of naming the gospel after a hated tax collector?
That's true.
If it was a forgery, if it's a forgery, um, we see the forgeries that come later in the second century, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas. Why are they named those? They're named after famous people that were close to Jesus, but we know that they're forgeries because of how, I guess, crazy the documents are and how not they don't conform to orthodoxy. So why not name the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Andrew, or something like that? Why the hated tax collector? It doesn't serve the purpose of the church. The other one would be Luke. Luke is a relatively insignificant figure in Acts. He's an insignificant figure, and he's not even mentioned in the Gospels. So why name a gospel if you're trying to promote Christianity? Why name it after an insignificant Gentile doctor to promote the religion?
Well, even going to Mark, I mean, everybody knows that Mark was very close with Peter. Why did they name it? Why is it according to Mark instead of according to Peter?
Yeah. So those are questions, and I think each one of those could qualify as a criterion of embarrassment. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to, if you're trying to promote or generate some following for Christianity, to say, hey, yeah, this gospel here is named after the Jewish trader who's a tax collector that was with Jesus. That doesn't appeal to most people. Or this insignificant person who doesn't even name himself in the book of Acts. He just says we, right? So I think that's one piece that looking back on it, and for future discussions, when you hear that, or when anybody else who's watching hears that, you need to say, hey, actually, there is historical attestation to who wrote these, and also there's not one piece of historical evidence to counter that, to counter, those attestations. Why don't other writers who are writing against Christianity, why don't they say it's not actually Mark who wrote this, it was actually so and so, it wasn't actually Luke, it was this person? We simply don't have that in the historical record, and in light of evidence to counteract that, we should accept the attestation of the early church. The other thing that was mentioned was, and I caught the end of it, was there a discussion about crucifixion practices? I think Paul might have talked about that for a little bit.
Crucifixion. Oh, I think with there might have been see, one of the points I think is pretty interesting is we've got 3 different passages in the Old Testament that says we've got basically Zechariah 12:10 or 12:11. We've got Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 that indicate that Jesus was going to be pierced. And so the idea is the Romans were not doing crucifixions when those particular passages were written. But people have argued that, yes, they actually were doing crucifixions. I mean, people say a lot of things like that. So that's one argument that I have heard, although I don't remember if I heard it last night. But trying to think last night as far as crucifixions, what I heard, I don't recall.
What we often, I guess, real quick, slammed, Luke was a Gentile doctor. With regards to the crucifixion practices, one of the things that we hear is we don't know that Jesus was buried because the standard practice was to throw them in a mass grave.
Oh, that one. Yeah, that's right.
Was that mentioned?
Yes, that's
okay.
We mentioned that in Apologia, mentioned that too.
Okay, so the problem with that is that that's not a standard practice with regards to Jews until after AD 68. Lacona notes that in his book on the resurrection. That Josephus documents, I think it's in Antiquities, Josephus documents that in adherence to the book of Deuteronomy, that prior, trying to remember, that Josephus documents that Jews who were crucified were taken down and given proper burial rites, and that dates to about AD 68. But then after something like AD 70, that stops. So in part, Pauly is right that is a standard practice, but it's not instituted for Jewish people until after AD 68.
Interesting. Yeah. So that's
So,
a.
and let me real quick, let me go get the quote from Lycona. I'll be right back.
Oh, okay, great. So in the audience, I want to say thank you everybody for being in here. I see Agrippa, Slam, Dastardly Dawkins, a few people I don't recognize, although Slammed is new. I thought I saw you last night, Slammed. So thank you so much for showing up and subscribing. I noticed that you subscribed to me, so I appreciate that. So, and now Dean is back. You already found it. That's really quick.
Yeah. So here's the book on the resurrection by Lycona. And then let's see, pertaining to the faith of Jesus. I had it underlined.
Let me say something. You know, I wrote a
Yeah,
dissertation for my PhD program, and mine was only a couple hundred pages. So the fact that he's got a 600-page book out of a dissertation, wow, what a dissertation!
Yeah,
So,
I mean, he says that he was obsessed, and I don't doubt that for a minute. Okay, it should be right in here. Sorry, it's a big book to navigate. I just saw it. I don't want that.
well, I'll tell Slammed. I've got that. Last night I flashed the historical atlas that I have. She said she likes big books. I've got this gigantic.
Gotcha.
Or he says, I see Slammed. I can't see it. I can't see Slam's face to see if Slam's male.
Okay.
Actually.
So in talking about the resurrection or about the crucifixion, Josephus reports particularly brutal treatments after being whipped severely with rods. Some were crucified, and while alive, their wives and sons were killed, and their now dead infant sons were hung around their necks. So that's an interesting fact about all that. But it says here, okay, so likewise, the one. Oh, that's not it. Okay, I think I'm finding it. Sorry. Okay, here it is. Josephus provides an interesting report that indicates Jerusalem was the exception to what Pelagia mentioned. 2 or 3 years prior to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, mercenaries from Rome killed some Jewish high priests and did not permit their burial. Josephus adds that until then, the Jews had taken great care in their burial of the dead, burying the crucified prior to sunset on the same day. So that's Lycona, and that quote comes from Josephus' Jewish Wars, book 4, I believe, 317. So Pelagia is right in the sense that the practice was normal, but it wasn't normal until after AD 70. So Jesus is crucified in 33 AD. There's good enough reason to believe that he was taken down and he was buried on the basis of Jewish practices from Deuteronomy. So.
Great. See, now you've given a lot of tips that people can use when they're going to battle against people online about these different nuggets.
Yeah. Can I just mention one last thing? I'm so sorry for taking up all time.
Oh, no. I love it. That's good.
Okay. So just for those of you who are engaging with people, one of the things that you want to do is you want to ask 3 primary questions of the person on the other end. The first thing is anytime that a statement's made that you're not sure about or you're skeptical about that it might be true, you want to ask, what do you mean by that? So, for instance, someone says, what do you think about evolution? Okay, what do you mean by evolution? Because there's like 6 definitions, right? What do you mean by that? Second question is, how did you get there? So, okay, I believe this about evolution, A, B, C, D. Okay, what do you mean by that? This is what I mean by that. How did you get there? How did you arrive at that conclusion? Right. So what these 2 things do, it allows you and me to sit back and just listen. Right. It puts all the onus on the other person. And then what you can do is you can formulate an if-then statement, which means, okay, so if that's true, then doesn't this follow? So, for instance, if it's true that prior to AD 70, the Jews could be taken down from the cross and buried that same day, doesn't it follow? If that's true, then isn't it probable that Jesus wasn't put in a mass grave the tomb that belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, right? You see how that works?
Yeah, I like that. Did you get that out of an apologetics class, or?
Absolutely. Greg Kokel's book, Tactics. It's amazing.
That's a good book. I haven't heard of that.
And so, because what often happens in the conversations that I have, I'm sure in the conversations that some people have, is that we have a tendency as Christians and as apologists to defend, but we never get to go on offense, right? So this, as Coco talks about, this is going on offense from a defensive position, right? In asking a question. And so I would just encourage you guys to practice that and work that. And so the next time someone says something that you're not sure about or you're skeptical about, be like, okay, so what do you mean by these documents are anonymous? What do you mean by that? Right? Okay, how did you get there? What's the evidence that you have that helped you arrive at that conclusion? Okay, well, if that's not true, or if history attests to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being the authors, then why should we not believe that they were the authors? So that's kind of the formula for that. So.
I like that, you know, and we see that a lot because we see most of the time when you're going up against atheists, a lot of times it is you are on the defensive. They're like, well, this isn't true, or that's not true, and that's not true. And sometimes it turns into almost a gaslighting little festival. And I haven't seen too many debates where anyone's come up with, like, for example, last night I presented all of these sort of what I would call facts surrounding the crucifixion and the resurrection. But rather than take okay, well, what's the best explanation for all these facts? Well, to me, it's Jesus resurrected. What is your best explanation? And what they'll do is they'll go through each fact instead of actually coming up with one that can explain all of the different components. So they never give an alternative.
Yeah, and that's something specifically with regards to your conversation with Paul Gia last night is if there's one small critique that I would give, it would be don't allow the opposition to dominate the conversation. It almost was like, not that I thought you did pretty well last night. But one of the things that seemed to happen during that conversation was that whenever Paul wanted to move on to another fact, or Paul wanted to move on to another subject, or Paul wanted to move on to another topic, you let him. And what you can do is say, okay, wait. Before we move on there, I need some clarification about this. Like, are you saying that, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that the normal practice for crucifixion was that bodies were placed into a mass grave. Is that what you're saying? Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Okay, so, and then you ask a what if question. So what if that wasn't the standard prior to AD 70 for Jews, right? That's something that I would encourage to do more of in your conversations. You're a great speaker. You're a great talker, great debater. I love watching you debate. But those are just some things that that you can't let him off the hook right there. You can't let him tell you what point you're going to go to. You don't move from your point, my lioness sister. You don't.
No, I was having a hard time last night because I was trying to get my points out, and a lot of times it was like I'll be in the middle of a point, and then suddenly Paul's like, let's move, or I don't know, it was kind of hard last night. And so,
well, in that case, what you just say is say, hey, Paul, I appreciate what you're about to say, but I just need to finish this point, and then we can have a dialogue, right? Yeah. That's how I would approach it, and so that's kind of one of the things that you can do. I wouldn't worry about offending Paul. Paul's a good guy. I like Paul. But when Paul wants to make his point, he makes his point, regardless of whether you're speaking or not. So it's true. He did last night. And I like Paul. I don't have a problem with him. But
I'll take your advice tonight, because tonight I'm going on with David Smalley. I don't know if you know that. At 8 o'clock.
I don't know. Who is David Smalley? Enlighten me. I know it's 4:30, but he's
in Hollywood, I guess, and he's a comedian. I didn't realize this. I didn't really know him. And but a few people have gone onto his show that I know here on Twitter. And so a couple of atheists somehow connected me with him. And so I said, I'd do it. So I started looking at his videos. He's probably going to be the toughest one I'll ever or have ever faced. So tonight's
Okay.
I'm going to be saying
What are you guys talking about?
That's the funny thing. I don't even know. So I'm going to find out.
You don't know what you're talking about?
No. I know it's going to be on Christianity. That's what I know.
Oh boy. Oh man.
Yeah. Well, I'm okay. I
know you are.
topics.
I know you are. It's more me. Like if that were me, I'd be shaking in my boots just because I don't know what the topic is. But you've done this a lot more than I have, and you're proficient at it. So I'll be rooting you on for sure. Are they gonna do? Is this non sequitur or is this something different?
No, this is this guy's channel. He's got a channel called Dogma Debate.
Dogma Debate. Okay. Yeah. I will
watched it last night while I was debating. My husband was watching Dogma Debate, so he could get tips for me on how to beat this guy in the Dogma debate.
Gotcha.
So I've listened to 3 of his debates, so I actually know I have an idea of the kinds of things he'll probably ask.
So just remember, hey, what do you mean by that? How did you get there? And then formulate if-then statements, and that way it forces him to justify what he just said. That way you don't let him off the hook. But you'll do good. Anyways, I'm done. I don't need to sit here and preach to the choir. You know what you're doing.
No. I love advice, believe me, and I need a lot of it. I'm new at this too, just like you. So anything we can get, we're all in this together. We're all
absolutely
dealing with this. And I want to say thank you to everybody who showed up. I see Cameron, my old buddy. I haven't seen Cameron in a while, but on Twitter, we used to be kind of like go back and forth. And now he's, I see him on YouTube now more. So,
cool.
And Slam, just been nice to see you. Nice to see everybody here. Dastardly Dawkins, anyone who's still left in the chat. Thank you so much for showing up. Again, just to mention how to find you, go to Daily Apologist, right? So Daily Apologist, and you have it on basically every
platform that I have, daily_apologist or the Daily Apologist. It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, Instagram. Website is www.thedailyapologist.com. We've got a bunch of stuff on there. And if you want to email me a question, my email is thedailyapologist@gmail.com. So not hard, very uniform.
That's easy enough. Well, so thank you, everybody. I just want to say, please like or subscribe. I'm really happy that you're here. Please share the word that we're trying to get the word out. And we're going to go ahead and God bless you. Bye-bye.
Here, guys.